There were some things in the great and vast darkness of the galaxy that, for humanity, it is better that they remain unknown. For others, the pain inflicted by those deplorable creatures goes far beyond the physical realm. There are some within the Imperium who, through no fault of their own, are exposed to and understand the suffering inflicted by the darkness of the warp and the chaotic entities and beings that exist in that parallel space. However, they're not the only ones who carry the darkness within themselves. There are others who, in many respects, are equally depraved figures who live every day to inflict suffering, but not only pain, not only tedious, but now pain through physical agony. No, there are those who have turned the suffering of others into a culture itself, whose citizens bathe in the distilled pain, despair, and agony of others. These diaries, otherwise known as the Eldars, aspire to belong to a salvage house, and thus regain their lost glory and respect throughout the galaxy, which also exists somewhere in the void. They're opposite poles, and are known by the Imperium as the Drukhari, or, more crudely, the Dark Eldar. And these lost souls, unlike their brothers, have no such laudable aspirations, but rather to consume and saturate their minds in the darkness and the nightmarish orgy of pleasure combined with suffering that once unleashed the thirsty god of the slow Aeneas Sage on the galaxy, the god of chaos who in his violent birth destroyed the Eldar civilization as it was and ended the age of struggles, in which the Proto-Drukhari destroyed their own race. At that time, unknowingly, they allowed humanity to be reborn in a new era in which the Emperor of Humanity would rise to power and his warriors would dominate the galaxy as part of a new empire of man. Unlike the vast majority of the Eldars, although some saw the horror looming on the horizon and made the necessary preparations, others were fortunate enough to find themselves protected by a coincidence of perverse necessity. This is the story of those depraved beings, because today we will finally learn about the Dark Eldar. The obvious place to start is, strangely enough, the beginning, except that I have already spoken at length about the early origins of the Eldar, their early history, their mythology, and how they managed to impose their dominance over the galaxy. If you want to know more, you can watch my video Dark Origins Part 2, whose link you'll find at the end of this. In addition, people often ask questions such as what did the Eldars do during the many millennia that preceded the expansion of humanity during the Dark Age of technology? And the answer, of course, is that this period is very cloudy and very uncertain for us, although we have some indications and some understanding of this era. It is possible that, like the Tau and humanity, the Eldars were so arrogant with their great power that they underestimated humanity's capacity, and by the time they realized how powerful we had become, they could no longer do anything about it. There is no documentation that points to a conflict between the ancients and humans during the Dark Age of technology, and given that humanity existed on a much higher and more developed plane of existence during this time, it seems likely that they maintained a cautious but cordial interaction. It was an elder seer of the shadows, Larry L. Ray, who mentioned in a casual comment that the ancients had defeated the ancestors before the time of the Empire, but it was no more than that, a provocative and derogatory comment that could be interpreted as an improvised insult rather than fact. However, it must be taken into account that, at the time of humanity's rise, the Eldars were probably already in decline and very concerned about it, much less interested in what other races were doing, which they considered unimportant and certainly no threat. As always, I must point out that this is only my speculation, but, as usual, it seems to me a reasonably logical assumption, given what we know and the absence of other substantially contradictory evidence. The point is that the Eldars were doing their thing for a long time. The warp had been blocked, and that is another thing I have to talk more about. The Necrons were asleep, which left the Eldars with absolute dominion of the galaxy. Like all empires, little by little, over vast periods of time, they began to fall into a slow moral decay, and that was like a horse that was left unchecked. And when it had consolidated enough to be obviously offensive to many within the Elder Society, it was already too ingrained to do anything about it. But the Eldars were true masters in general, like humanity in the Golden Age. They had very little to worry about. their technology was so advanced that they were able to print matter, and they had all kinds of machines to perform any kind of work that was necessary. In addition, they feared nothing, as one would expect from a race capable of destroying planets and rebuilding them at will. Any enemy that opposed them could be easily annihilated. In fact, discoveries have been made that suggest that the Eldars, during this golden period, had developed their understanding of psychic power and how it could be channeled to the material realm. In fact, they had developed a technology that allowed them to think of something and for it to come to life, such as an infantry gravity anchor, a titan, a spaceship, or in theory, even an entire planet. So they would connect to this machine, imagine this thing, and there it was. The power of this is obviously terrifying to even imagine. If you want to read more about this in particular, thank you here to the community that helped me identify it as the Book Fist of Demetrius, because I knew I remembered it from somewhere, but I couldn't remember the specific book. It is here that some Imperials find an ancient complex with a machine that allows things to materialize, apparently from nothing. It is a very interesting point of the lore, so it is worth looking for. It is a good read, but the main thing to understand is that the Eldars before the fall were an extremely advanced race, both in mind, spirit, and physically. They have senses far beyond humans. They can move at the speed of light, and human eyes can barely perceive their emotions, which are so strong that if a human tried to process them, they would go crazy or simply collapse mentally. Now, unbeknownst to the Eldars, who had existed for millions of years with the warp as a source of power, things were stirring in the immaterial darkness, and it is important to remember that what feeds the warp the most is the excess of emotions. So many people are quick to assume that the Eldars played an important role in the creation of the dark gods of chaos through the war in the sky. And the best guess about this is that this is not entirely false, but it is not accurate to say it definitively as a default assumption, since the Eldars, due to their extremely powerful emotions, have always been aware of it and have a certain level of destructive capacity, so they learn to control it both in battle and throughout their lives. Another thing to remember is that when humans die, their souls feed the warp, but this was not the case for the Eldar. The souls of the Eldar are not the same as those of humans, and the Eldar were reborn again and again. So, for them, events such as the war in the sky did not bring billions of souls to the warp, and at the same time, neither did the Necron tyrant, since their souls were consumed by the Khotan. This is a fundamental mistake that people make when they assume that the war in the sky created the god of chaos, when almost all aspects of this seem to have been insignificant in their contribution to the war. Now, it will undoubtedly have had some effect, of course, because the Khotan were going around destroying planets, but they were also feeding on the souls of the living beings that were there. This is another mistake that people often make when they say, well, the Khotan were destroying all those planets, and there was destruction everywhere. How was that not going to feed the war? Because that was the reason why the katana attacked those primates, was to extract the soul and energy of living beings so that that would not enter the war. Of course, their suffering, their anguish, and all those other things undoubtedly contributed and fueled the distortion. But, again, where was the tipping point reached? How long did it take to reach the level at which the gods of chaos were activated? I don't know. The point is that the Eldars, until the dawn of humanity, would undoubtedly have had some impact on the war, but despite their powerful emotions, it seems that this was less than when humans began to kill each other en masse and directly feed the warp with souls, and reproduce like rabbits in the process. While all humans, with the exception of the Nulls, have some psychic presence, the Eldars, of course, have a powerful psychic presence due to their own nature, and this means that from the perspective of the warp, the Eldar souls are red-hot beacons, while humans are mere specks of distant light, little more than dust particles caught in a ray of light, except that until the dawn of Slaanesh, this had never really been important, but, of course, all that would soon change similarly to humanity in its golden age, but perhaps even more so for the Eldars, whose life at the height of their power was beyond what could be described as paradise, without any stress or problems, with total dominion over the galaxy, and they lacked nothing. They dedicated their time entirely to creative hobbies, whether artistic, recreational, mental, speculative, philosophical, or literary. Their psychic manifestations encompassed everything, and remembering that at that time most of the Aeldari society was based on planets and not on the craft world that we see today, they had also discovered and learned to use the webway, the vast system of psychic tunnels that exists outside the material and immaterial. An important note, to travel quickly through the webway, you need psychic energy. Otherwise, crossing it would take much longer. You can travel through it, but like any psychic weapon, to obtain maximum power, it is necessary to imbue it with psychic energy. Otherwise, it would be simple and not especially effective. The webway was built by the ancients, and the means for its construction and repair were taught to the Eldar. It was believed that they had mapped it to some extent, but this knowledge was considered so great that it is now only preserved in the Eldar's Black Library, hidden deep within the webway. Route is only known by a select few of their species. Some even suggest that the paths of the webway could also extend forward and backward in time. The Eldar themselves understood the danger of this and never used these temporal aspects. There is more to discuss about it, but we will probably have to leave it for another occasion. However, the webway allowed them to travel safely between their worlds without actually having to use space or the warp, and this is another thing that people don't usually think about when they ask how it is that the ancients did not come into conflict with humanity. Well, for one reason, they didn't travel with starships all over the galaxy. Thinks when he says, well, how is it that the ancients did not come into conflict with humanity? Well, for one reason, because they did not travel with spaceships all over the galaxy, and they traveled with ships through the warp as humanity had to do, because, of course, they have ships with sublight speed, but unlike other races that usually use the warp to cross those vast distances, the Eldar have no need to do so, because why travel in real space or in warp space through these vast distances when you can simply cross the webway and be there in a fraction of the time with complete safety? So this is a pretty simple reason why the interaction between the Eldar and humans in their early days seems to have been very minimal. There is nothing mysterious or deceptive about it. They simply did not meet frequently. This is not to say that they never had conflicts or interaction, but it is evident that those uncomfortable confrontations were minimal, since otherwise the consequences would undoubtedly be more evident, even taking into account the Dark Age and the Age of Strife. Another key factor is that the type of general social structure that existed in this pre-fall period was not very well established. What we do know is that it seems to have been relatively dispersed. That is, it had some clinal culture, which is also reflected in how this continues today and in the craft worlds that Crawford describes. I would like to think that the same groups that existed during the culture of the Eldar prior to the fall in this cultural framework certainly meant that, just as in our world and the fog that exists between countries in terms of what was happening, it meant that when the culture of the Eldar began to change, it probably did not become clear immediately that this was happening. And even when things began to become more extreme, it is really unknown how much this would have been commented on to other parts of the civilization of the Eldar as a whole. For the Eldar who live now, in the time of the Imperium, this lifestyle of carefree indulgence and technology has been completely lost. If you want a modern analogy that is quite accurate, you could say that the Eldar of Millennia 41 and 42 live practically under a psychic blockade compared to their previous situation. They are largely confined to their craft worlds and avoid as much as possible interaction with other races other than their own. The Eldar lost a lot because, on the one hand, many of their worlds were instantly annihilated with the birth of Slaanesh, but also because much of the technology of the Eldar depends heavily, if not exclusively, on psychic power, since from their beginnings the Eldar had immersed themselves in the warp and had focused all their attention on how to use it to build and develop their culture. This is not something that should be overlooked. Although the Eldar understand science, just like humans, because they're an advanced race, they never went through the same process of research, industry, and mechanical manufacturing as humanity. In fact, there are probably things they don't understand. Instead, they base their culture on wraithbone and Asai plastic, based on the energy of war, created by some known as Bonezingers, while the Imperium is based on the knowledge of the Golden Age, very focused on science and mechanics. The Eldar use psychic power and wraithbone for almost everything, but since they are so weakened and fearful of attracting the attention of Slaanesh, this greatly limits them in terms of what they can use is still much more than other races, but not nearly what they would have done before the fall, and this is one of the reasons why they're so tied up in Millennia 41 and 42. And then, of course, we come to the Dark Eldar. For the Dark Eldar, things are very different. Basically, their fear of Slaanesh caused a very severe decline in the use of psychic powers, which in turn caused their ability to use psychic powers effectively, if they could, to atrophy completely. As I said before, it is not entirely clear what kind of power structure the Ancients had before the fall. It seems that they had some kind of capacity that was respected, and that the Ancients seemed to be divided into what could be described as clans. Probably, the best way to think of them is similar to the period of the Greek city-states, where there was no real central government, but they were still informally united and their specific areas were independent. This seems to be a fairly reasonable comparison to the Ancients before the fall. It is likely that, in the distant history of the Ancients, they were more united as a single people, but over time they fragmented into specific areas that did their own thing. Basically, they had a lot in common: the language, the collective history, etc. And for a long time, there was no need to form a large global government, because it simply was not necessary. Normally, some kind of global structure is needed to manage things and deal with threats, and to make some kind of collective decision because it is necessary, but on the outside they did not need it. Their lives were assured, and within their specific region, the decisions were probably made by a council of elders. Elders, not Eldar, probably did not need to be more complicated than that. And if it were, they probably would have grouped together and united, but most of the time that was never necessary. So, over time, this fragmented structure probably made it more difficult for them to reach a consensus on how to avoid the problems that were beginning to arise in their society in the social sense. And, in all probability, this probably made the problem even worse. With some worlds beginning to fall into ruin, others with an idea of what might be to come, but they did not really see what was happening elsewhere, and others were in the middle. So the Eldar have become extremely indulgent as a people, but nothing more than that. They have simply become decadent, which possibly inevitably leads many to begin to long for that excessive lifestyle. And, to quote one of my favorite phrases, some Eldar factions or clans sought to become explorers of the farthest regions of experience. That is, they began to experiment with both pain and pleasure, and perhaps with a combination of both. As with all addictive vices, this little by little began to get out of control. Those who practiced such indulgence lost perspective and became increasingly perverse. The Eldar society in general was rotting morally and ethically, like a virus spreading through their culture. Some worlds were completely consumed by this attitude, others less so. But everywhere they had gone from a life of relatively innocent access and indulgence to truly abominable and perverse acts, which purported to be extreme enough to satisfy the increasingly jaded senses of the slowly darkening elders. At first, the core of the Elder Society was not fully aware of what was happening because much of this descent into depravity occurred behind closed doors. There was talk in hushed tones on the streets about strange cults and societies. We can imagine how these things happen. It starts with tentative conversations, questions to see if you fit into the group. Once trust is gained, you are invited to a meeting, and from there everything spirals downhill. Over time, these groups become more brazen. They can publicly test the waters with morally questionable activities. They try to downplay the extreme so that society becomes gradually desensitized and exhausted with conversations about these groups, and little by little, until finally it is too late. Only those who are known today as the Exodites began to understand in time the direction things were taking, and they could be considered the harbingers of the end of the world of the Elders because they saw the signs. Basically, it's like getting the hell out of here, and we started a retreat to worlds that were very much on the periphery of the Elder Society and the galaxy, selecting worlds to settle and where we could stay far away from what was coming. However, beyond this, the Exudates were also essentially prophets of doom, and, like most prophets of doom, were dismissed out of hand by most of society, who simply did not want to admit or even consider at such an early stage that they had a major problem on the horizon. This was one of the weaknesses of the Eldar, their unbridled arrogance and ego, and, as I often say, it is very common for people never to want to change a comfortable way of life and react to a situation until it is literally too late to do anything about it, and real-world examples can be chosen because they are the order of the day. Unfortunately, these doomsday prophecies were dismissed as Puritanism or as a fallacious project to sow fear that was sure not to materialize. The counterargument of the Eldar hedonistic cults was, what's the worst that could happen? Russia. What came next was the beginning of the total collapse of the Eldar civilization, which saw how worlds that were previously informally united became increasingly polarized. And that is when many began to see that things were not going in a stable direction and began to advocate for an end to the excessive lack of self-control shown by these dark cults of pleasure, while the other side, of course, responded with more virulence, shouting that they could do whatever they wanted and that anyway, what are they going to do about it? Now, you may think that this is where a civil war could break out, but it seems that the elders, trying to avoid an even greater downward spiral, understood that that was not going to help or improve the situation in any way besides that is how things happened. The point at which the situation could be constructively salvaged had probably already passed, but more and more discussions began to emerge to try to rationalize things. Some despair because their lives were meaningless, as they no longer sought to advance or fight for anything, while those on the opposite side claimed that, in fact, it was precisely their lives of extreme and endless experiences that should exist to honor those who had not been able to achieve such things before, and that, in fact, the pinnacle of a lifestyle they had always sought to achieve, that they were doing the right thing, and that they should accept it and move on as things continued to deteriorate, although, of course, they got worse and worse. Descriptions are heard of the darkest aspects of the society of the elders, who were no longer satisfied with simple pleasure and experimentation among themselves. This is where we begin to hear about the first pleasure cult gangs that capture the innocent and drag them to become prey and torture them for days, weeks, or months in the most perverse and creative ways imaginable. By then, the Exodites have long disappeared, having abandoned their civilization as a completely lost cause. This is also where we begin to see parts of the Elder civilization moving from their planets to resettle further away. We also have the First Guardians who strive to reinforce the traditional Elder lifestyle, pure, but with violent actions if necessary, although nothing that goes beyond a simple vigilante action, nothing more unified than this. And then you begin to finally see the creation of the craft worlds. Bastin, designed to house only those of pure spirit, created out of necessity, as their worlds are being devastated by those individuals consumed by dark excess. Over time, the artificial worlds will become, of course, substitutes for the shattered worlds of the elders, which now contain little more than the remnants of what was wandering in glory as they begin to reach the end of their days. The society of the elders is in a state of total collapse. Many worlds are now, in essence, completely consumed by nightmarish horrors and dark cults that have turned the once glorious worlds of the elders into brutal hunting grounds, ruined wastelands filled with suffering, populated by deranged individuals who prowl day and night in utter desperation to feed their insatiable addiction to pleasure and suffering, which they can now only satisfy with the most extreme acts to try to elicit any feeling. The members of these dark cults have become basically insensitive to any feeling, be it pleasure or pain, and this numbness pushes them further and further to imagine by what means they could feel that adrenaline, that mental saturation of emotions. And that only means that now the only way to achieve is to carry out, in the most literal sense, the most unimaginable horrors on their victims, music, as the power of these dark cults continued to grow beyond the walls of the ancients and some of their activities became increasingly extreme. For whatever reason, it was considered wise to move to the webway, and this movement of some of these cults in what is still essentially the fallen of the webway is what from now on I will simply call the Dark Eldar, because then they begin to seize hidden ports and established strong fortresses at key intersections of the webway to ensure the security of their degraded activities. It is important to understand this because sometimes you can get the feeling that the decadence of the ancients was a chaotic anarchy in which psychopaths ran rampant. And that is not entirely false. However, those at the highest levels certainly had a more orderly sense of their degraded pleasures in these dark cults, the Dark Eldar. These webway crossings and access points were all connected to a vast city built within the webway itself, and this was the Eldar city of Commorragh. Commorragh was originally the largest of the webway port cities, right next to the ancients, and was able to transport a fleet to any of the collective empire's most vital planets thanks to its numerous webway portals. Because of this access it provided to remote corners, it was considered the most important place in the entire webway and, as such, was too important to be controlled by a single state of the Eldar councils, so it was managed more autonomously. This meant that suspicious activities that might not have been possible in the previously well-organized worlds of the ancients were much more feasible here, largely due to its high value as a nerve center within the web network. Commorragh expanded rapidly, in fact, so much so that as it spread into the void, it began to consume other web network port cities. The properties and subkingdoms grew, became larger and more impressive as they fed and plundered resources. All this, of course, remained largely hidden from the selfish lords who at that time roared in the dens of vice of Commorragh, next to their adoptive city, initiating more and more Eldar into its shadowy depths. It was as much out of necessity as out of need that it became a place of attention for the dark cults of the Dark Eldar, as it perfectly suited their needs in every way. Out of sight, out of mind. So when Slaanesh was finally born in the warp, the psychic wave that consumed trillions of Eldar and billions more tore reality as the Eye of Terror appeared in the galaxy as a gap between the material and the immaterial, and entire star systems fell into orgies of horrific cannibalism and violence. Most of the outer race was annihilated in an instant, regardless of whether they were dark cultists, pure elders trying to reverse the tide of despair. They were all consumed by a cataclysm of terror and pain. Many ancient planets were destroyed or violently absorbed by the warp. In its place stood a maelstrom of chaos now. Mr. Nash reveled in the incomprehensible agony that consumed everything, and the warp storms that had ravaged the galaxy finally subsided. There was no force capable of containing this event. Slaanesh was such a powerful creation that it consumed the ancient gods of its ancient mythology. The few surviving elders were now scattered throughout the galaxy, and for a long time, in a deep state of shock, unable to comprehend the true horror of what had happened to them, and above all, their inability to prevent it. Deeply marked their sense of superiority and invincibility. But the worst was yet to come, of course, when they discovered that they were unable to be reborn as they always had, and that they were now, to some extent, mortal entities like the dirty monkeys of humanity. The souls of the elders, annihilated by the birth of Slaanesh, were now captives of she, the thirsty one, and would suffer endless torment at her whim, while Slaanesh exterminated both the pure and the depraved who inhabited real space. This was not the case for those who remained on the webway. However, the birth of Nash was so powerful that the psychic waves were felt even in the webway, which suffered terrible damage from the explosion that passed through it, ruining some paths forever and damaging the Eldar constructions inside. Those who had settled in the surroundings of the webway that contained Commorragh survived and suffered minimal damage, such as the Aldercrawford, the Exudates, the Harlequins. They had escaped the incredible horror of Slaanesh, unlike many Aldar that continued to exist in real space. The elders of Commorragh felt no need to repent or atone for their sins. They saw no need to change their customs, unlike the Puritan elders, who even now were restructuring their civilization and developing new strict paths to follow. These were concepts foreign to a people who recognized no limit to their power or their capabilities, and very soon both the surviving elders and the Dark Elders would discover that they had a serious problem, both discovered with horror, that they could no longer be reborn through the warp as they had for millions of years. But the Dark Eldar discovered something even more disturbing. I don't want to go into details, as this is what I originally wrote for the introduction to this section, and then developed it enough for a standalone video. So instead, I've tried to distill the essence of what I originally wanted to say, which is a rough idea of the rebirth of the Eldars and their soul. The Form created a situation in which the Eldars could no longer reincarnate, and furthermore, it is also important to note that it is clearly stated that the gestation of the Eldars is considerably longer than that of the inferior races, be they other humanoids. For the Drukhari, for the Dark Eldar, the traditional Trueborn are extremely rare and something of a status symbol in their society. In relation to this, the description of a longer gestation is not further clarified. However, my speculation is that, since this description points to the possibility that it is very difficult to conceive, one wonders if the Eldars are not comparable to fictional worlds such as Children of Men or The Handmaid's Tale, where conception becomes very difficult as a species and children are highly valued. Unlike those dystopian worlds, perhaps this was not a devastating biological change for the Eldars, but an aspect naturally designed by their race, since we know that the Eldars were created by a careful, impressive design by the ancients in the early days of the galaxy, in the most ancient times. It seems that the Eldars were able to reappear in the warp, which could be a reason why they did not need normal or effective means of conception, or perhaps it was even intended to ensure that they did not spread uncontrollably and become too big a problem for the ancients, who did not plan to be exterminated by the Necron and Caton. And when you think about it more, it makes sense that you design a powerful psychic race. But you want them to work for you, not against you, so you allow them to be continually reborn and come out of the warp. But you don't want them to constantly reproduce, as this could create some more problems later on. When the ancients are destroyed and the warp is cut off, that low conception rate becomes an even bigger problem. Although this time for the Eldars, it is so confusing that it is very difficult to draw solid conclusions, and I will expand on this later separately. What we do know is that the conception of the Eldars is difficult and takes a long time, so they cannot easily replenish their race. In addition, there are other problems because the fall allowed them to realize that if an Eldar died, his soul would be consumed by Slaanesh. But for the Dark Eldar, it was much more than that. They realized that their souls were also being drained very slowly by Slaanesh due to the intrinsic connection of the Eldars with the war itself, and they discovered that it was absorbing the energy of their souls, so to speak. And this is where the Soul Stones, or Spirit Stones, come into play. You see, the Eldars of the craft world do not seem to suffer the same soul-draining effect as the Dark Eldar, but they do, as they have spirit stones that protect their soul. The idea is that if they die, these stones capture their soul and can then be placed inside the infinite circuit of a craft Eldar, which is supposed to be basically like a self-contained and free warp space for a sword. An artificial place where the souls of the dead Eldars merge and remain safe in the darkness of the warp and the Slaanesh. Obviously, this is just an overview. There are more details about all these elements. Another reason why the Eldars of the craft world may be cautious about having children is that any Eldar, including the Trueborn, will need a new spirit stone to protect themselves from the flesh, and spirit stones cannot be manufactured or reused. They can only be found in one of the Crone worlds, which are ancient Eldar planets that now reside in the warp or in the Eye of Terror. So gathering spirit stones is not only extremely difficult, but also incredibly dangerous. And although the Eldars often use specters to get them, sometimes it is more problematic than it is. So, without readily available spirit stones, or at best with very few, this is not useful for creating many new Eldars. This is a very important thing to understand in relation to the Eldars in general. They cannot suddenly have millions of new children because it would be extremely dangerous for those children if they died without spirit stones. All this really comes down to understanding that the souls of the Eldars are different from those of most mortal races. As I often say, they are more powerful, more durable, and, more importantly, they're less directly connected. They're apparently able to separate from a mortal vessel and connect to another. And this seems to be largely intentional if the ancient myths and legends about the origins of the Eldar have any truth. But why do I talk so much about Crawford Eldar? Well, because you have to understand the context to understand the Dark Eldar. The Drukhari suffered what is known as soul drain or spiritual leech, which means that they are constantly bleeding their life force to Slaanesh. And this is one of the reasons why the Dark Eldar cannot use spirit stones as the Crawford Elders do, because this soul bleeding seems to corrupt the spirit stones, blackens them, and makes them unusable. In addition, spirit stones are usually given to the elders when they're very young, and a very close connection is formed with the soul of the elder, which become one in many ways, so that the man is secondary and his soul leaves the body and enters the spirit stone. Most of the Dark Eldar are very old at that point, and trying to connect them to the spirit stone is not only extremely dangerous for them, but very unlikely to succeed, so they simply do not use them. That said, they do have other uses. For example, the Incubi, a warrior order of the Drukhari whose sole purpose is to kill as many times as they can. That, as initiates, they must kill an aspect of the craft world in single combat, shatter their spirit stone, and return it to their Arkansas. Only then can they be fully admitted as Incubi. The shattered spirit stone is rebuilt to become a psychic torture device and mounted on the chest of the incubus, where it emanates an aura of terror and malice that penetrates the minds of even the most intrepid enemies. The bottom line is that, for one reason or another, the Dark Eldar do not use spirit stones. In fact, they have other means of coming back to life and not being captured by Slaanesh. This also contributes to understanding that elder souls, as I say, are not like human souls. They do not fall like a raindrop into the ocean. Elder souls are much more stable, persistent, and independent entities, almost like a permanent life force. Very difficult to extinguish and can be moved, but before continuing, what exactly is this soul extraction? Why does it seem to affect only the Drukhari and not the elders of the Croft world? Well, the answer is more complicated than you might think, and this, unfortunately, is another thing that is not especially clear. However, I remember that there is some reference to this in an older text known as Introspections on Perfection by C.A.I. Sandra, the Anchorite, the elder of the Croft world, and it is divided into 3 parts, which are the following. Life is for us as the linen labyrinth was for Elfinish, with its mysterious corridors that lead to wonderful views and nightmarish encounters in equal measure. Each of us must walk the labyrinth alone, following in the footsteps of those who came before us, but also forging new routes through the labyrinth of existence. In times past, we were drawn to the darkest secrets, running wildly through the labyrinth seeking to experience all it had to offer as individuals and as a civilization. We lost our way and, in so doing, created the means for our perdition. Limitless exploration led us to the darkness of the fall, and in the void that followed, a new path was revealed, the path through wisdom. We spent our lives exploring the meaning of existence, moving from one part of the labyrinth to another with discipline and guidance, so as never to get lost again on the path. We experienced the full potential of love and hate, joy and pain, lust and purity, filling our lives with experiences and satisfactions, succumbing to the shadows that lurk within our thoughts. But like all journeys, the path differs for each of us. Some wander for a long time in the same place. Others expand their journeys and visit many places for a short time, while others stay for a long time to explore every nook and cranny. Some of us lose our way and abandon the path for a while or forever. Others find dead ends and get caught in the spring storms of youth. It is common among our people to question the validity and even the sanity of our paths, especially the pursuit of perfection in a single field, the path, as our ancestors have called it since its creation. Although young people are intellectually capable of studying the tragic lessons of the fall and the great enemy unleashed by our ancestors, their vision of the universe is too narrow to truly see the lessons intrinsic in the terrible events that destroyed our native worlds and pushed our survivors to wander the stars. It is true that in youth there is as much courage as stupidity, and an unwavering belief that there is no obstacle too great to overcome, no enemy too powerful to defeat, no problem so complex that it cannot be solved. On the contrary, it could be said that those who survive the tumult of the galaxy, the confusion of the galaxy, long enough come to believe that all obstacles, enemies, and problems cannot be solved, only alleviated for a brief instant of history, which in turn is nothing more than an instant in the slow dance of the universe. This is how young and old clash incessantly over the need for the path. The young rebel against the restrictions it imposes, just as our ancestors did. They wish to savor every sensation, every emotion of their new world as soon as possible. They do not fear the great enemy created by the desires of our ancestors, since all their conception of evil comes from distant tales and legends, and what instilled fear in them in childhood is rejected and ridiculed in adolescence. Only over time can they begin to feel the terrible thirst that we gave her and begin to understand that she is a mirror image, a reflection of our worst excesses, given life by the debauchery and depravity that preceded the fall. Long ago, our race realized that the only way to circumvent the great enemy was to break the reflection, to live a life of denial and focus on a single aspect of life, pursuing it to perfection, which is anathema to the young, just as it is to the great enemy. The young did not desire the discipline of the path, but curiosity pushed them to taste all the fruits of the tree. This is how many take the path of wandering or the path of damnation in the early years of adulthood, and thus the great tragedy of our species is repeated again and again, and the number of hours is reduced from generation to generation. The greatest truth about the path is the easiest to say, yet the most difficult to understand. And in this profound moment comes the understanding of the genius of the Assyrians and the flaw in their genius. There is only one path, and it unites us all. We can unravel the threads down to the infinitesimal details, but their presence distracts from the overall flow of the plan. Be poet or dreamer, warrior, seer, or outcast, the events of your life are threads in the core of your destiny. So all your life is nothing more than a thread in the rope of the Elder's destiny. We all walk the path as a single species, and, collectively, we must learn to control our passions and our fears together or face destruction by one and the same. It is a rather long reflection, but it gives us important information once you analyze it within the prologue. This line states that on the path we experience the full potential, but without ever succumbing to the shadows that work within our thoughts. In the second part, there is talk of many elders who do not truly understand the nature of things until they experience them for themselves. And only then can they begin to feel the terrible thirst that we gave her and begin to understand that it is a mirror reflection of our worst excesses, given life by the abyss or the tree and the depravity that preceded the fall. Long ago, our race realized that the only way to circumvent the great enemy was to break the reflection, to live a life of denial and focus on a single aspect of life, pursuing it to perfection. Next, it also mentions how the tragedy of the fall is repeated again and again, and that their number is reduced from generation to generation, which also reinforces my belief that the elders not only have few children, but that those they have, even if they are protected by soul stones, are still corrupted by the thirst of Slaanesh. At first, perhaps for some of them, this corrupts their soul stone, and if they are lost, then too slow and ash. There's also the feeling that they try to teach their young people the dangers of Slaanesh, but that no study can prepare them for its true power and horror. In the end, the fact that we are a single species is underlined. We all walk the same path or face destruction. We are all the same. So these three pieces of Cassandra give us a deep insight that, in fact, the elders of the Croft world are not immune to the soul drains suffered by the Dark Eldar. This is something that really affects all the elders, only that the path of focus and discipline of the elders of the Croft world, and not the abject horror, seems to clearly distance them from this. However, their younger children do not understand it until, as described, it is too late. Understand that she is a mirror image, a reflection of our worst excesses, to which the deep or the tree in depravity have given life. Well, it suggests to me that if you align yourself with the excessive and ultimately perverse lifestyle, which is that of Sloane, then you look in the mirror into the darkness, and your soul will bleed into the warp or something like that. Anyway, the Dark Eldar discovered this soul-draining process shortly after the fall, but far from avoiding it, They developed their own methods of dealing with such problems, and it is to allow the drain to work, but whether they are Drukhari children or adults, instead of trying to stop this process, they simply decided, hey, why not continually fill the container so that it never empties? Simple, except that to achieve this, a life of meditation, discipline, sobriety, and abstinence are not essential aspects to follow the path of the Dark Eldar, but quite the opposite. And of course, there lies the possibility that, if he is born with that gift, the craft-world elder who follows that path will face his own soul siphon. But as I said at the beginning of the chapter, it is just a theory or a story that we will have to leave for another occasion. Thus, the Drukhari soon discovered that, through their extreme acts, they could satisfy the thirst of Slaanesh that drained their own spirits. This is where Commorragh becomes the center of their world and their existence. Slaanesh, the elder of the craft world. The Dark Eldar have nowhere else to go. They have focused entirely on satisfying their increasingly depleted souls in their constant need to engage in decadent depravity. The Dark Eldar had now become little more than sadistic parasites subsisting on the anguish of others to avoid the slow death of their immortal souls. 10,000 years later, in the 41st millennium, Nash's thirst continues attracting them. There really is no escape at all. The Drukhari have condemned themselves unknowingly, exchanging a horrible but quick death for an eternity of macabre hunger, and that is how the Drukhari became raiders of mortal souls. Their appearance visibly changes depending on the time that has passed since they quenched the thirst that constantly devours their souls. Those who have not drunk from the suffering of others appear visibly emaciated, even by the standards of the elders, who are already thin as bones. Their skin may appear dry and withered, and their bodies more fragile now. Those who have drunk from the torment of others shine with an aura of perfection, their skin cold but radiant with life. However, they may appear as shadows to some, as they are empty shells and exist only to fill that void. Furthermore, it should be noted that the innate psychic abilities of their straight-as-an-arrow brothers has deteriorated to a point where they can no longer use them to channel the energies of warp and chaos. Actually, inside Commorragh, it would invite disaster, so the Dark Eldar do not use psychic powers there. Of course, this is somewhat problematic considering that they exist within the network, but it will reach them, even if it is manufactured instead of being psychically developed. The Dark Eldar weaponry is as advanced as that used in the craft worlds of the ancients. In matters of war, the Dark Eldar are artisans, and their imagination and skill have led them down a sinister path. Their favorite war tools include fragmented weapons that can ignite every nerve with rays of dark light, whips that cause acidic hemorrhages, and eldritch soul traps. The Dark Eldar were so focused on the agony of others that their light suits even incorporate bladed plates, not only to protect themselves, but also to provide them with another weapon against their prey. The warriors of Commorragh know each and every possible action with which they can kill the other inhabitants of the galaxies and delight in perfecting their skills. The Drukhari abandoned the material dimension long ago, and when they emerge from their fortified city, it is only to hunt their unconscious victims, who have no idea of the horrors awaiting them. They almost never dirty their tongues with the savage grunts of the inferior races, but use translators when they must communicate. For the Dark Eldar, all aspects of their character are taken to the extreme, including their condescending arrogance now. The Drukhari Commorragh attacks the weak inferior races in pirate raids as they swoop down on the world that they will reap with entire armies screaming from their war portals in the midst of the enemy aboard Baroque ships before launching into the slaughter and, yes, literally bathing in the decadent jets of arterial blood and explosively dismembered corpses that splatter their path. For the Dark Eldar, the visual horrors they unleash are as pleasurable as the visibly clean tear of a razor blade on soft flesh or anything they choose. They enjoy indifferently breaking the bodies of their captives, but that raw and tedious pain only provides them with a few moments of pleasure, since the Drukhari value even more the cruel crushing of the spirit of their captives, because nothing is more rewarding for a Dark Eldar than securing absolute dominion over someone who has resisted them, which, curiously, aligns them very closely with Slaanesh, who drank every nuance of pain from their captives, who were left in a vegetative state, barely able to articulate a word through their shattered orifices, which could somehow be interpreted as a petition for death. How regrettable, how pathetic, how dare they have the audacity to ask for something like that, except that it is likely that, even if this wish were granted to them, it would be another form of mental torture, since for many it would not be the liberation they desired, but they would be brought before the repugnant Dark Eldar, guardians of life and death, who hold in their twisted claws the destiny of many. For the many whose mind have already crossed the limit of consciousness, they will be dismembered and reshaped to turn them into immortal trophies or even grotesque objects of jewelry, furniture, or decoration. Many of the Slayer Haemonculi present disturbing moans, nervous spasms, and things and objects made from the still living remains of their favorite victims. Other unfortunate captives who are no longer of any use will be slowly reduced to nothing, as if they were grease. Their final destiny is to be absorbed as some kind of elixir or powerful narcotic destined for the monstrous beings who stole their precious lives. And all this is just a small sample of what happens in the darkest corners of Commorragh. Commorragh is the center of everything that defines the Dark Eldar. It was their salvation during the emergence of Slaanesh, and now it is their whole world. Commorragh is the launch pad of the Drukhari. It is their central city from which they venture into real space to drag their unconscious victims into the dark corners of hell. It is important to understand that when we talk about the network of tunnels that connects one place with another, it is a common mistake to think of it simply as that corridor or tunnel that connects two places, but the webway is much more than that. Like the warp, it seems to ignore dimensional rules and physics. The spaces within it can be absolutely vast, large enough to transport entire fleets of ships, even entire cities, and, who knows, potentially even planet-sized bodies. In theory, it could contain an entire race in complete isolation from the rest of material and immaterial space. It is tempting to think of the webway as another dimension in itself, except that it is not, and it is important to remember this, although for all intents and purposes it acts as another dimension. But the webway is an artificial pseudo-space built that exists between the material realm and the warp. That is why it can be accessed from both and can be linked between these spaces. The other faction that is dedicated to the dimensions is, of course, the Necron, but God knows that I'm not going to go off on a tangent right now and subject you to another kind of physics. Many sections of the webway were destroyed during the fall and have deteriorated even further since then. The barriers that once acted as a defense against the dark energy of the walk were destroyed beyond repair by the foe, and when activity intensifies within Commorragh, the totality of the psychic signal of the Drukhari radiates even more power than usual, thus attracting the entities of the immaterial towards the dark city like Aeldari's predators that pick up the scent of blood in the water. The Drukhari referred to these incursions as disjunctions, and the catastrophic nature of these events for the inhabitants of Commorragh should not be underestimated. Infernal and deformed creatures burst through the cracks of the webway to devour the souls of any Dark Eldar they encounter. Whether in the spires or in the slums, it does not matter to the demonic entities, and soon all of Commorragh becomes a brutal war for survival. However, the disjunction has eclipsed the devastating consequences that occurred during the rupture of Cain. The disjunction has eclipsed the devastating consequences that occurred during the rupture of the Gate of Cain, which returned to the network. However, the important thing is to understand that, although the network is described as a bridge in a series of paths, it can also open up to large dimensional spaces that allow the existence of entire cities like Commorragh, and perhaps even larger, for common mortals to contemplate the worlds within the network. It could be a mind-blowing experience, as ordinary laws do not seem to apply here at all. In fact, it may even seem that the eye is playing tricks, and it becomes very difficult to look at for the average mortal. And even so, the webway is no longer what it was and now. Although they take refuge from the storm of the warp, the Drukhari are far from safe here, which only fuels their anxiety and their heightened sense of the precariousness of their situation. Commorragh is the dark city that feeds on a constant flower of corruption, as it attracts evil towards itself and then exhales it back into the void. Today is an endless nest of architectural contradictions and spatial anomalies now. Each of its estates has been so overexploited that its growth has been forced to shift to the vertical plane in the rival region, sprouting upwards like a tangle of thorny plants fighting for a ray of sunshine. Each of these spires and towers is attached to its elevation by hundreds of curved arches and strands, and covered with complex silver structures that glow with stolen energies. Its imposing palaces rise and fall in spirals that delve into the depths, captivating the space with each passing year. The parasitic city seeks to devour more and more, with a hidden dimension acting as its host. Some areas of the city are better known than others. Some are mapped, and some are not. Others mean death for those who enter without permission. The personal kingdoms of powerful archons or cadaverous homunculi who do not look kindly on unsolicited intrusions. However, the greatest dangers are those regions that have fallen into disuse due to structural or dimensional collapse, and these can take the form of wastelands haunted by monsters, vitreous debris and ossified remains, or lakes of boiling poisons and screaming shadows. Matter will often suffer dimensional breaches due to the partial or total collapse of the network that surrounds them. It can be bombarded by the light of dying stars, or exist within fields of entropic radiation that reduce living beings to dust in seconds. But the most desolate areas around and below the great city are known as Lower Commorragh. These ruins are full of spies and hidden complots that this darkened wasteland, the Drukhari, who have fallen from grace or have gone through difficult times, exist here. They are forced to feed on pain as hungry refugees and fight each other for the privilege. Here exists a place known as the Central Core, a dangerous place with twisted ravines where, at its base, lies the River of Acid. Yes, that one, a river of acid, because once you have your river of acid, you can fight to the death for it. The loser is sent to a horrible death by dissolution to become part of the foamy caustic sludge that then bathes its banks. There are also mercenary districts in various slums here, on the periphery of what is known as Drukhari civilization. Assassins and hunters compete for the best assassination contract distributed by the Dark Eldar Cabal. The inner rings are known as the core of Commorragh, and here are ancient noble houses containing strange citadels attended by purebred warriors, some of whom are said to descend from the original Elder of the Fall. Below this region is the underworld, so called because it exists as a labyrinth of darkness and horrors where the convent of the Haemonculi exists. It is a disturbing laboratory that extends under the core of the city, where they practice their strange trades along a distressing labyrinth of dark chambers in which no one would dare to peek because of the sounds that emanate from within, since no one would want to become disoriented in its vast halls and hidden passageways. With the walls of the twisted staircases illuminated by lamps sewn into the eye sockets of unsuspecting visitors, and the bodies of countless alien species are flexed to, align with the walls, and exist as still living relief sculptures. The homunculi covens, despite appearing to be frightening dens of depravity, are actually very valuable to the inhabitants of Commorragh. They are dedicated to body modification, drug production, and, above all, they are experts in the resurrection of dead flesh, and the reason for this will be clarified shortly. Finally, we come to the abyss of pain, which is very aptly named and not at all exaggerated. Experts in the resurrection of dead flesh, and the reason for this will be clarified shortly. Finally, we come to the abyss of pain, whose name is very apt and not at all exaggerated. It is one of the newest regions of the city and also one of the most dangerous and horrible. The reason is that the abyss is plagued by demons. This may sound strange and quite contradictory, but it is a very recent phenomenon and a direct result of what is known as the Great Disjunction. To understand it, we have to talk about the Gate of Cain, a region of Commorragh located in the depths of its lower core and known only to a select few. It is a direct access door to the war. Remembering what I pointed out about how the network connects the material and immaterial space, and that, therefore, it can be open to anyone, regardless of where they are, the consequences of this opening to Commorragh should not be, obviously, something that anyone would want, and even less so the Dark Eldar. Now, in the period 497M-41, something began to test the weak points of Commorragh and its surroundings, methodically trying to locate the entry points. It was observed that a constant tapping began to be heard on the other side of the gates of Cain, and from there, a figure known as Overlord Effect, a very powerful Cabal leader, in fact the most powerful Dark Eldar in existence, orders that some 500 Drukhari incubi warriors be permanently stationed at the gate so as not to take any risks. Vector also establishes security systems around the gate, such as temporal flow mines, nulls, and a dimensional mirror that will launch anything reflected on its surface directly into the heart of the sun. However, this increase in strength does not serve to stop the growing activity. Whispers and micro-vibrations begin to be noticed. The Overlord, who now regularly inspects the gate, claims to have personally witnessed the fall of the Elder. This is true, since it is very possible that he is one of the oldest mortal beings in the galaxy, with more than 10,000 years of age, and as a consequence of having survived for so long as ruler of Commorragh, it also makes him one of the most lethal individuals in the galaxy. In his youth, he rose to power by unknowingly or perhaps deliberately causing the death of all the other rulers of Commorragh when he captured a salamander, a T starship, which led to an imperial invasion of Commorragh. When it was all over, the Starties had killed the lords of Commorragh, and Vector emerged as the next most powerful figure, a ruler, if you want to call it that, but things only got progressively worse. Those in charge of guarding the gate were slowly going crazy from the endless and increasingly omnipresent whispers. Some of the incubi guardians began to carve, "Let us in on the walls." Others carved this message directly into their flesh in a crude way, and many others did it all over their bodies, causing horrible lacerations that reached the bones, with the flesh and fat literally hanging from their bones like loose cloth. Others simply lost all sense of themselves and cut off their own limbs or those of others. Despite all this so evident horror, which continued to suppress the widespread knowledge of what was happening, he decided that it was prudent to move his Cabal away from the area and place them in well-guarded subkingdoms. Then, after something like half a century of increasing activity, a distortion storm caused the Gate of Cain to light up with an incandescent white for several moments. One of its powerful hinges breaks with the sound of thunder, and at that precise moment, all the portals of the Dark City flicker and then come back to life. Even so, this singular moment plunges hundreds of thousands of people into limbo or simply tears them apart in transit. The Dark City soon plunges into turmoil and demands that Vector implement immediate measures and a total disjunction, in a counterproductive effort typical of Drukhari. But there is so much suspicion and paranoia among them about the strange plots of others that Lady Malice, leader of another Cabal, is very suspicious of Vet. She believes that his activity around the gate and the riots are intentional and that, for some reason, he seeks to provoke the opening of the gate. Continuous skirmishes begin to occur, and none of them seem to realize that, in reality, they are fighting for the same goal, but of course they never realize it and continue to stab each other in the dark core of Commorragh. A small crack appears in the Gate of Cain, and the caged nulls begin to scream. Later, when the reign of Aeldari is possessed by innate, the power of this event sends a psychic shock wave known as a hyperspace earthquake, or, for the inhabitants of Commorragh, a disjunction. This causes massive destruction in the city. The needles fall and millions of people die. But the worst is yet to come, since finally the Gate of Cain collapses under the force of this psychic disjunction that now surrounds it, but dies by force, and then, literally, hell is unleashed. Demons rush through the gate into Commorragh, destroying everything in their path. Meanwhile, Vector, who had already abandoned the most dangerous areas, was negotiating with his Cabal in these dark and prepared corners of the network for Commorragh to decide whether his rival Cabal should act or die. That was none of his business. Only when the warriors and slave armies of Commorragh extend beyond their limit in efforts to save the city from demonic destruction does Vector finally play his card. He summons the Incubus warriors, using pacts and all debts, to fight the demons at a high price. The demons are gradually cornered in a confined area that now contains the distorted, open hole that was once the Gate of Cain. This zone is then separated from the rest of Commorragh and plunged into an infernal abyss known as the Abyss of War, which has been spoken of before. But, despite everything, all they have achieved is creating a chaotic, demon-ridden abscess in the lowest center of Commorragh. More subdimensions of the Dark Cities are submerged in the abyss, while armies of warriors and their slaves try to prevent the entities of chaos from reaching the heart of Commorragh. As if that were not enough, this is where the Great Crack will open into the galaxy. Another wave propagates through real space and the network, destroying countless portals and doors that lead to Commorragh. All sections of the labyrinthine dimension dislocate, and through the fractures in the interstitial space, more demons rush inward. Meanwhile, the Empire of Men is besieged by the warp, and half of the Empire is plunged into shadow. The ability to travel and communicate between systems has been almost completely lost, and each world is isolated in darkness. The servants of the gods of chaos begin their campaign of killing. The Watchers of Commorragh see that these worlds are ripe for harvesting, but however appetizing these fresh fruits may be, they must deal with the cataclysms taking place both in the network and in Commorragh, with all the incubi of Commorragh trying to stop the tide of demons and the bitter rivalries that have long existed between the elites of the city erupt in a bloodbath. The murders become blatant and habitual, and the ghost of civil war looms over all. However, just when the inhabitants of Commorragh seem willing to tear each other apart in their cities, to the amazement of our overloaded Vector, he is assassinated by the mandrake of an unknown master. At the same time, his essence is destroyed, guaranteeing that he cannot be regenerated by the homunculus. We will discuss this shortly. The threat of internal conflict is soon replaced by an unsettling calm, as all Right must assess their alliances. If Vector can be killed, which of the Drukhari can be sure of their own survival? The holocron elders of the Veiled Paths prepare a wake for Vector to be held in the Nexus, an arena of the cult of witches of the Cursed Sword. Many begin to suspect that it was the Cursed Sword who orchestrated the disappearance of the Supreme Lord, while others suspect that it was Lady Malice, since she and her poisoned-tongued Camarilla have withdrawn from Commorragh in the fractured needles of the webway. Nevertheless, both Vector's subordinates and those who come to gloat before starting a war to divide his territories flock to the Great Wake. But at the height of the ceremony, the arena is saturated with potent airborne hallucinogens, and the Harlequins unleash all their fury on the present Archons. The Archons, the leaders of Drukhari Cabal, join the fray on the side of the Veiled Path, the holic winds of the witches of the Cursed Sword, as well as the prophets of flesh and the warriors of Vec's own Camarilla. The blood of the Archons flows in great rivers, and amidst the screams of agony and terror, Vector rises from the center of the arena, with a perfect body and eyes full of broth. When the killing ends, the Archons who remained faithful to the effect are resurrected by the prophets of the flesh, as are some of their enemies, who are converted into twisted monsters whose sole purpose is to serve the Supreme Lord through their suffering. With the high spheres of Commorragh weakened, Vec's position is now almost impregnable, and he proclaims himself a living dark muse, the closest thing to a living saint of the Empire, or, if they were really powerful, even a minor god of the ancients. However, it should be remembered that he himself granted it to himself, so it is quite spurious. The abyss of disgrace, although it could not be completely sealed, remains a constant threat to the city of Commorragh. The Drukhari tried to stop this apocalyptic invasion by creating a series of subdimensions between the Gate of Cain and Commorragh itself, transporting ruined parts of the city towards the path of the incessant demonic attacks. In this way, the demonic incursion is prevented from reaching the heart of the city, but to maintain this precarious security, More subrealities must be added to the abyss every day to prevent the forces of chaos that arise from them from overflowing. If they ever manage to break through it and reach the city, they will undoubtedly devour Commorragh from within. As for the changing balances within the strange relationships of the ancient Dori, many Harlequins and Drukhari join behind Yvraine and the Aeldari in their quest to destroy Slaanesh, a bigwig who does not share this vision. Residing in the spires of Commorragh, the Supreme Lord of Act continues to develop his plans to end reign in the Aeldari, his great quest that poses a direct threat to everything the Drukhari have tried to avoid for so long. The Drukhari contain a myriad of forces, to list just a few. The incubi, the ravages, the scourge as Mandric, the succubi, the witches, the hellions, the grotesques, and Kronos. But we will see all of them later calmly, since today we will focus on three fundamental areas of Drukhari culture: the Camarillahs, the cults, and of course, the homunculus covens. The orders of the Drukhari are, in essence, their power structure. It is not really a political structure in any sense, but rather a flexible grouping of autonomous organizations that are a mixture of organized crime, pirates, and aristocratic nobility, all the best things for a healthy society together. Finally, the Camarillahs vary enormously in terms of their role, territory, reputation, power, etc. The rivalry is fierce, and assassination attempts between bitter enemies are common. A small Camarilla usually houses several hundred elders, while a major one can contain millions. In some respects, it is not so different from a strange combination of nobles from a hive city seeking to maintain family power mixed with gang wars from the underworld. They focus on their daily activities of capturing slaves, manufacturing drugs and weapons, controlling territory, and of course, beheading any upstart who develops ideas above their station. Elitism and the status of the Camarilla are a way of life, and many areas of the city are only accessible to certain noble houses. Overlord Vector, of course, crushed the ancient old order when many of the Drukhari lords were killed, and that is when the Kabals system took root in the Drukhari way of life due to the benefits of belonging to a Cabal. Competition to enter their ranks is fierce, which means that it is often difficult to completely eradicate a Camarilla. Since the turnover of new applicants is always very high and dangerous tasks are assigned to the newest members. For this reason, especially in areas of the city controlled by multiple low-level Camarillas, the streets often look more like a battlefield, with continuous battles and skirmishes almost daily, although these are largely ignored by the more powerful Camarillas, who do not want to get dirty with such crude matters when a creative sword in the dark is much more effective. These internal affairs of Commorragh are not what most Drukhari really aspire to, since the real prize is to participate in a raid in real space, which usually has two objectives: the acquisition of new slaves for horrible tortures or simply for decadent feasts of pain without limits. However, those who participate in and return from such raids obtain invisible benefits, but not, of course, for the mortals they leave crying in their wake. Raids into material space increase a Drukhari's prestige within the Camarilla and depend on their success. In addition, successful raids by other Camarillas are a means by which a Camarilla can rise to a prominent position over its rivals without the need for small street skirmishes. In reality, although raids are usually carried out by the most important Camarillas, since it is in them where they mainly concentrate their resources and manpower, these launch large-scale raids with attack ships against any target, from defenseless wild worlds to hive cities, where they plunder their resources and drag thousands of slaves back into the darkness of Commorragh. Unlike many races of the 41st millennium, the Drukhari spend a lot of time obtaining information about their targets, since raid can be a costly and dangerous task, and they do not want a surprise force of rookies to ruin their plans. The main objective is to return with enough wealth, but this is calculated to justify the assault and the losses suffered. Another difference in Drukhari raids is that they are rarely a frontal fight within the galaxy of the future. It is interesting to consider that most battles are fought in a relatively direct way. The orcs simply throw everything they have at you. The Necron do the same. They don't need more. It really is chaos. And the Tau, who could be more tortuous in their plans. Now, Obviously, it would be absurd to suggest that all factions are like that at all times, or that there are no factions, including the Imperials, that do not use some kind of information gathering or stealthy and more covert methods to win the battle. Because, of course, we could list countless examples, from assassins to years of infiltration. Even the orcs have infiltration units. But what is remarkable is how much the Drukhari prefer confrontations that are not a direct fight and actively avoid them whenever they can. For them, traits like honor are simply something to exploit. They will always hit the enemy's weak points and will continually disorient and sabotage. If that means shooting someone in the back, they will do it every time they can. They will focus their attacks on the command elements, the officers and communications. They will seek to quickly create disorientation and panic in their enemy, and will feel no shame in disappearing into the shadows when the fight intensifies, if that means they can counterattack a weakened unit elsewhere. Needless to say, any target is valid, whether armed, unarmed, women or children. It is the same for them, and the less danger they pose, the better. Like most forces, whether the Imperial Eldars or the Cabal of Xena, who often prefer an attack style, such as the deployment of winged attack ships with great infantry firepower and armed helicopters to suppress and crush enemy positions. Despite the use of ships, most of the Dark Eldar will always prefer melee combat over any ranged engagement, and that is why they do not usually have very powerful ranged weaponry. And the reasons for this should be obvious, since it allows them to savor the suffering and torment of their victims as they lacerate and tear them apart in every imaginable way in creative dances of death. That is why their vehicles are usually fast and light, since their function is to allow them to get close to combat as quickly as possible. These orgies of visceral bloodshed usually leave the streets awash in blood, and the victims who are not dragged back to Commorragh, lying in plain sight, while the trembling remains of the dismembered victims lie scattered around the place. And this is just the tip of the iceberg, of course. Many raids by the Drukhari include horrific practices, such as disfiguring the victims, tearing the skin off their bodies, and then dragging their captives screaming as if they were animals tied by their own skin. Some may be nailed together, and some Drukhari may even tear the faces off their victims with brutal but surgical precision to increase the screams of torment of those around them in a nightmarish cacophony of despair. Music. Then we come to the witch cults, the purveyors of public perversion. They are also known as the Coats of the Sands, since they organize logical and additional battles for the masses to enjoy, accept honor and skill, and are not on the menu here. They are designed to be more violent and extreme with each confrontation. The reason for the existence of these arenas is that, despite the continuous raids, there are not enough mortal slaves for each Drukhari to participate in continuous personal torture. So these events are a way for an ordinary Drukhari to whet its gazer, so to speak. Without the witch cults, it is debatable how long it would be before the Drukhari began to turn against each other, just as they did in the last days of the Fall, when the dark cults of the Eldars hunted through the streets looking for anyone to satisfy their insatiable craving for suffering. Therefore, these disturbing arena combats are actually a very important way to keep the dark and thirsty wolf at bay for the Drukhari. Obviously, for this to be effective, the arena shows must be spectacular in their horror and rarely disappoint. The butchery that is shown leaves the public very satisfied after having witnessed how the predators of Xena gorge themselves on defenseless victims or one-on-one battles whose final result is usually a prolonged death in the cruelest display of barbarism. The arenas themselves vary from strange labyrinths of death traps to a field of elevated platforms full of rotating blades and pools of acid below, not to mention those with all kinds of strange beasts, usually with large amounts of teeth. Some use the strange way in which physics seems to become flexible within the network, as observed by mortals who set their eyes on Commorragh. These arenas may contain strange kinetic traps, mechanisms that are energy-based hazards, or simply spaces that defied any rational sense. However, the arena itself is not the limit of these exhibitions, since often the fights extend to the public. Sometimes literally, they can fight above the crowd, through bridges, mobile platforms. Sometimes a fighter can even involve the public, depending on what they do to a defeated opponent. The arena crackles with tension. The spectators lean forward in their seats with wide eyes, and the layers of hungry predators loom over their faces, whether they are aerial ballets of bloodshed, mass murders in zero gravity, or carefully selected menages lurking. All cult performances have one thing in common. The arena is covered in blood and viscera at the end of the show. However, these cults are not purely for entertainment, like the ancient gladiator battles. The witch cults generate considerable social power within Commorragh and, consequently, are very valuable allies for any clique, not to mention the fact that their members are usually thousands, all of them highly trained assassins who are worth recruiting for any fight. They also dedicate their time to helping the Kobold because one thing they need is a strong supply of new slaves for their arena shows. So the arena, which cults of the clique benefit from the strong ties that exist between them, but they can also operate independently, and their raids are considered an art form in themselves. To Dark Eldar, a place in these raids can cost a lot. All that being said, despite all the art and pomp with which the witch cults are adorned, and for what they are mainly known, their shows are true orgies of violence and butchery. They are experts in combat and employ surgical precision to disembowel their enemies. Anyone who witnesses their clashes would describe the horror as a strange juxtaposition of joyful celebration and ruinous horror. Wherever the witch cults go, they leave behind a trail of shattered and mutilated mortal corpses. And finally, we come to the coven of the Haemonculi. They are legendary masters of torture and despair, but they also play a much more vital, even critical role. For the Drukhari, at a basic level, they produce drugs and toxins, cruel abominations that are dedicated to body modification, abominable and unnecessary surgeries, and vivisection. However, their endless experiments and diabolical methods have led them to have power over death itself. Under the Drukhari, this has become one of their most valuable services, and, at some point, all Dark Eldar must visit the Haemonculi, probably not by their own choice. They occupy the vast labyrinth beneath the core of Commorragh, and here, in the darkest pits of the damned, they ply their trade and indulge in horrors that mortals can only describe as the mythical realm of hell itself. Their halls, rooms, and corridors are a labyrinth of optical illusions, with living mortals twisted into the shape of objects, eyes that follow you embedded in the walls, and many things that seem to be in a state of still life. Despite the apparent impossibility of such a fact, as we have discussed above, the birth cycle of the Eldar is longer than that of other races. Although this is not specific to Vega, it must take a considerable time, since the Haemonculi have developed a process by which artificially cultivated Drukhari are the most common method for procreation. They grow inside insect hives that permeate the Haemonculi's lair. Inside these chambers, Drukhari embryos are artificially accelerated, although, again, this is an unspecified period. They are ready break into a kind of chrysalis-like sac to become what is known as half-born, despised but common members of Commorrite society. However, their true power lies in their ability to prevent death, so to speak. To achieve this, high-ranking members of a clique must enter into something akin to a Faustian pact with the Haemonculi, whereby they will regenerate their body if they're killed, but to do so they must agree to hand over a portion of their eternal soul to the Haemonculi. This again has weight in what we have come to understand, that the souls of the Elders are very different from those of the other mortal races, and that their souls can, in fact, be treated as a commodity. The reason any Drukhari would want to avoid the permanent death of their physical body should be obvious. They do not want their soul to have nowhere to go but into the claws of Slaanesh. Thus, Haemonculi are able to restore an entire body, the physical self, with as little as possible of that person's remains. In addition to what I have already said about the Eldar soul and mortal souls, it seems that there is something more that we learn here about the way in which the ancient souls, the Dark Eldar Drukhari, seem to be able to exert some will over what happens next. This also ties in with the idea that ancient souls did not necessarily go to the warp immediately after death, but remained in something akin to purgatory, as long as the physical body could be restored within a day or so. there's a good chance that the Drukhari soul will be able to locate it and resume its undead state. However, it is known that sometimes the slaves and tortured victims of the Dark Eldar can also be resurrected by the light of the monkey in this way, so there may be something we do not understand about the soul. We fully understand. This is also the reason why, when they carry out raids into the material world, the Drukhari do not like to get involved in prolonged engagements that last for days or weeks. It would be unusual to see them participate in a prolonged campaign, especially if the risk of physical death was very high. They prefer to attack, get what they need, and get out as quickly as possible. So, if any important member of a Commorragh has suffered some unfortunate accident, they can be safely restored. The key to this terrible process is, unsurprisingly, pain. The Drukhari rejuvenate themselves by witnessing agony and, if saturated enough, can heal from almost any wound. Therefore, the mortal remains of those given to the dubious care of the homunculus are placed in glass-fronted capsules. These agi sarcophagi are arranged in concentric circles that rise into the darkness, each with a semi-cocooned Drukhari warrior in a regenerative state. Patients literally live off the dark energy of the torturers while the homunculus works on their victim, assisted by their servants and the semi-sentient pain engines, and a cacophony of screams rises around the chamber. Those installed in the cocoons slowly feed on the energies, gradually recovering their bodies, first the skeleton, then the muscles, tendons, and skin, until they're whole again. In times of war, it is common for all the regeneration capsules to be filled with red demons who tremble and chatter with each new scream. Of course, all this cannot be compared to the true horror of the homunculi, which is their presence during raids into real space. The homunculi are already terrifying enough inside Commorragh, but when they enter the real world, they surpass people's concept of a living nightmare. And the funniest thing is that humans kill. They compete with each other in what could be described as a sport, except that this sport is, of course, disgusting and disgusting. The members of a coven comp of a living nightmare. The funniest thing is the fact that humans kill. They compete with each other in what could be described as a sport, except that this sport is, of course, disgusting and disgusting. The members of a coven compete to create the most pleasingly abominable monstrosities with the twisted bodies and pieces of their captives, creating strange creations that are a true parody of the humanoid form, disgusting to observe, sad and pitiful in the eyes of the people twisted into these horrible forms, unable to speak, but with eyes burning with agony, twins of humiliation and despair, which say everything they cannot say, since their mouths are often sewn up or simply removed completely. The homunculi will unleash these infernal minions on their enemies, watching their effectiveness with interest. They consider this competition to be very inspiring and often congratulate each other if their rivals achieve some particularly impressive act of violence. Although congratulate might be a generous description, as it is more like orgasmic grunts, might be a more appropriate way to describe it. It is not clear how Drukhari becomes a homunculus. They are believed to be elderly, as suggested by their withered, nightmarish appearance. Their terrible state of self-mutilation leaves many monkeys unable or unwilling to perform physically demanding tasks. In fact, most monkeys avoid mundane physical exertion and instead perform their great tasks through subjects and minions. Interestingly, some homunculus covens have become interested in the development of primary marines. Although manned according to Commorragh standards, these genetically developed humanoids arouse the interest of Rakov Ario, who is now seeking to raid the material and capture a main heiress from each chapter to add these samples to his vast libraries of material flesh. Some of the Simian coven do not focus primarily on the physical, but seek the suffering of the soul. They prefer to see their captive victims degraded or driven to madness at an agonizingly slow rate. They consider themselves too superior to stoop to the level of physical torture, as these practices bore them, tediously repetitive at this stage. Instead, they challenge themselves to finish off a captive victim without even touching them. They seek to inflict suffering and despair through fear and torment until they drive her mad through a process of psychological torture. Of course, this can take many months or even many years, and they will stand by their victims to savor every second and every minute. This has allowed them to develop chemical or pathogen-based weapons. Some even suggest subdimensional parasites that lay eggs in the brains of their victims, which once infected cause those affected to have nightmares so intense that they tear out their eyes, tear their faces, or even stick sharp, long objects into their brains to silence the horrors from which they cannot escape or alleviate. Of course, the regeneration process is not limited to the Drukhari. Some homunculi make sure that their victims go through continuous repetitive states of childbirth, so that even if they die or commit suicide as a result of their torment, they will be forced to endure it again and again, unable to free themselves from their suffering. Of course, there is one more I want to mention: the flesh collectors. When the homunculi send their talus engines to accompany a raid into real space, these monstrous servants are usually tasked with collecting specific samples for their masters, which usually involves devouring certain types of creatures from a planet or subsuming a specific individual, such as a planetary governor. However, sometimes the demands of the homunculi are much more subtle when they raid Tal space. The talus, known as the Marrow Giver, was once ordered to consume only those fire warriors who had witnessed the slaughter of the rest of their strike team before them. Failure to perform such a task, or worse still, deviation from the instructions, will inevitably result in the dismantling and disposal of the talus. To two external observers, such rigor may seem wasteful, but in his art, the homunculus seeks absolute precision and perfection, so that the different types of material collected may have different properties, each with a unique purpose, of course. The musculature and nervous tissue combine in ways unimaginable to mankind, and the emotions absorbed by the flesh of the creatures upon dying are extracted, enhanced, and transformed into weapons. To contaminate that work with impurities, such as the flesh of a wrong species or blood impregnated with wrong emotions, would spoil the work of the homunculus, in which he may have worked for decades, and could deny the galaxy a completely new morbid creation. In addition, the homunca often wish to reconstitute the remains into gelatin of a victim of talus, and then revive her, so that they can interrogate her again before, of course, subjecting her to an atrocious existence of pain and suffering for any world that has endured the attacks and incursions of the Drukhari, whether they know them by name or not, the entities that mortals fear more than any other of the homunculi music. Finally, we often endlessly repeat the phrase, "In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war." But when it comes to the Dark Eldar, it might be more appropriate to say in the grim darkness of the far future, the Drukhari lie in the shadows. And they will drag you to a dark corner of their kingdom and subject you to unspeakable and endless suffering that will destroy your body and your soul. But it doesn't sound quite the same. The Drukhari are living nightmares, terrifying monsters who seek only to inflict misery, despair, and agony on others. Of course, this is totally true. But if we scratch the surface and get to a deeper level, stripping them of their spiky armor and their insensitive and cold exterior, in many respects they look more like scared and lost children who have strayed from the path, and now live every day in constant anxiety for each other and for avoiding the exhaustion of SL or to find their next dose. The Drukhari twist their strange imagination and their perverted ambitions to drive their society backwards, and yes, their hellish efforts are all too real for the slaves and captives forced to suffer in Commorragh. But all we can do for those lost souls is give them our compassion and our prayers, no matter who the Drukhari have dragged into the eternal night, where they find themselves in a blood-soaked torture chamber. Saturated with images and sounds that no one should ever want to experience, they will quickly lose all hope of ever knowing normality again. However, we can know that, in many ways, all this suffering, all this horror, is at least to some extent a perverse facade. Until recently, the Drukhari had no chance, no real sense of progress. They only existed to continue existing. However, there are some changes in the air. Certainly not all, but some of the Dark Eldar have begun to lean towards the emerging new cause of the Aeldari. This new path offers the Dark Eldar an escape route, an exit, and a new path that they can see may have some real value. While the Aeldari continue to move forward with fear of writing the next chapter of their history, as they do on behalf of one of the oldest races that exist in a 42nd millennium galaxy. The Drukhari craft world exudes harlequinary. When a fairy finally meets Slaanesh, they will all be Eldar again. The only unanswered question that still remains to be resolved is whether, when this finally happens, it will mean the total destruction of the Eldar or their eternal rebirth, ensuring a new era for the galaxy.